Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest educational webinar for GTA partners. Today's webinar will be presented by Kristin Sherwood, who's the Director of Programs, and Amber Stewart, who's the Social Responsibility Manager at FishChoice, and will cover FisheryProgress's new human rights and social responsibility policy. As you all know, social responsibility efforts in the seafood sector are still pretty in the early stages of development, and the new policy from FisheryProgress provides a strong starting point for fishery improvement projects, or FIPs, to take steps to improve their social performance, and providing you guys in the marketplace with essential information to contribute to due diligence requirements. The policy will support FIPs to start to report on their social improvement efforts, and in the long run enable FIPs to better protect fishers, which of course is of great interest to us in our social responsibility work area. The webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on the GTA website. As per normal, if I could ask you, if you're not speaking, to keep your microphones on mute, just to avoid any background noise. Both Kristin and Amber are very keen to hear from you. There will be plenty of time at the end for questions. You know what to do, put the questions in the chat box or just put your hand up or call them out at the end. And for those of you who have joined during the introduction, welcome, and I'm delighted to introduce Kristin and Amber, and I'll hand over to Kristin.
Perfect. Can you hear me okay now? Tom, no problem?
No problem at all.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Tom, for inviting us to present today. We're really glad to be here. We're really proud of the human rights and social responsibility policy that we launched a few weeks ago, and glad to have the opportunity to share it with you today. As you might guess, it's been a really big couple of years at FishChoice. As we've developed this policy, we've learned so much. We've had the chance to work with new organizations, talk with loads of new people about this work. Honestly, it's been a real honor for us. So again, we're really excited to have the chance to share with you today where we landed and get your thoughts and your feedback. So to get us started, I want to give everyone a quick reminder about FisheryProgress. Many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar, but just to get us all on the same page, FisheryProgress is a product of the organization FishChoice. FishChoice is the organization that both Amber and I work for. And FishChoice's mission overall is to create online tools that support and incentivize progress on sustainable seafood. And FisheryProgress, the platform, was created just about 5 years ago with the intent of offering companies throughout the supply chain good, consistent, credible information to help make decisions about whether fishery improvement projects met their sustainable seafood commitments. And so now companies know FisheryProgress as the one-stop shop, the one place to go for reliable information about FIP progress. So you can really find everything you need there. And the website really can handle FIPs of any size or scope. It doesn't matter if the FIP is a large-scale industrial fishery or a small-scale artisanal FIP. They're all on the website, and they all have the same way of presenting information so that it's easy for buyers to make informed sourcing choices. And so 5 years in now to running the website, we have about 95% of the world's FIPs voluntarily reporting on the website, along with thousands of companies and NGOs from around the world using it daily, weekly, so on, to help inform their seafood sourcing. So that's just a little nutshell on FisheryProgress. And I imagine you might be asking yourself the question, so why is FisheryProgress starting to bring in human rights issues? As you probably already know, the website was designed to track and communicate solely about environmental progress. And so that's how we launched, that's how we were founded. But in recent years, we've all heard of these investigations by NGOs and journalists that have been shedding light on the urgent need to start thinking about human rights abuses in fisheries alongside thinking about their environmental progress. So in turn, as we've seen some of these issues start to come to light, we've also started seeing seafood businesses, like many of yours, around the world starting to focus on and take action to address human rights risks within their supply chains. So in 2019, the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions updated their FIP guidelines. You can see the picture of those FIP guidelines here on the slide. And the intention of that update in 2019 was to start the ball rolling for FIPs to address social responsibility. There's no mention of it in the previous iterations of this set of guidelines, But now there's encouragement and guidelines, there are encouragement and resources set up in this set of guidelines to push FIPS towards addressing social responsibility. And also about that same time, when those guidelines launched, we started to see FIPS on FisheryProgress start to share information in an informal way on the website. Of course, the website's not set up wasn't set up to track social responsibility information, but because FIPS were really starting to get interested in it, they were sharing information. Again, it was about 20% of FIPS starting to share information informally about what they were doing around social responsibility. But one of the big things that spurred us down this path hit in May 2019. So at that time, we received an allegation of a human rights abuse within a FIP reporting on FisheryProgress. So that allegation really made us stand up and pay attention. And it made it really clear for us that FIPS are certainly not immune to the risks of human rights abuses, but it also made us really reflect and think about, first of all, if FisheryProgress didn't take action, didn't do something, we would, first of all, be putting our credibility at stake. But more importantly, really failing to act at this stage really meant that we could potentially be failing to recognize the potential risk that fishers within these FIPS were being exposed to. It felt really unconscionable for us not to do something, especially given the sort of tangibleness of this allegation that came across the transom to us. And at that stage, back in 2019, there was really not a systematic approach for assessing and addressing human rights issues across FIPS in a consistent way. So what we did to figure out what our approach would be was to embark on a pretty intensive 2-year process to engage hundreds of stakeholders, including the FIPS themselves, seafood buyers, conservation and human rights organizations. And the intent was to help map out a way for FIPS to report on social responsibility efforts on FisheryProgress. We tried to do this in a really collaborative way. And in this slide, I'll talk a little bit about the process that we went through to gather feedback. So you can see here, we took on 3 rounds of stakeholder feedback. The first round we started in late 2019, and really that was our initial effort to kind of figure out what is the community feeling about social responsibility in FIPS right now? What's the temperature of our stakeholders? And so once we got that, we started to dig in really deep, and we did 2 rounds of stakeholder feedback in 2020. First, to get responses and reactions to our original draft of the policy. And then later in 2020, we did another deep round of feedback to hear people's voices on this proposed set of changes that we made based on that original feedback that we gathered. So we gathered this information using surveys, group calls, one-on-one outreach. We probably talked to many of you on this call, and we got a great response. In just the survey by itself, we heard from more than 150 industry members, and overall across our whole information gathering process, we heard from 3/4 of the FIPS that are listed on FisheryProgress. That's a substantial proportion of the FIPS on the website. So we were really pleased. We felt like this was a really adequate amount of input to help us feel confident that we took the right path with the policy that we're going to outline today. So I want to share with you just a little bit about the things that we kept at the forefront of our thinking while we developed this policy. What we wanted was to create a policy that would have both impact on the ground for workers, really affect the situation for workers on the ground, and also be practical for FIPS to implement. So we really held these 2 things as our most critical values moving into this process. And we really had to work through balancing the needs of both the FIPS on the ground and the broader community of stakeholders that we were working with. So at its core, you'll know that FisheryProgress truly is about improvement and in transparency. And our goal with creating this policy is really in line with that. We want to incentivize positive improvement in the same way that we do for environmental progress. We want FIPS to be recognized for their work that they're doing to improve the risks, the risks to their fisheries, both environmental and social. And of course, ultimately, what we want that to lead to is the human rights of fishers being protected. So that's the impact side of what we want to accomplish. But onto the practicality side, we know that FIPS are not easy to implement, that FIP implementers often struggle with not having enough funds or capacity to make this work happen. And also that FIPS work in a wide range of contexts. You know, there's small scale and large scale, lots of different political contexts and so forth. And so it made us really realize that deciding on a one-size-fits-all approach is just not going to work for FIPS, at least not at this stage. So knowing that FIPS were going to be the most immediately and directly impacted by this work, we had to be very careful to think about how do we make this as practical as possible without really losing the impact that I talked about before. So it was really for us about trying to strike that important balance. So now with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Amber, and she's going to talk us through a little bit more specifically of how we landed the policy and what we included when we included in the document. So Amber, over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. So now I get to show you how we ended up balancing that impact and practicality. As you'll see, we're starting with a tiered approach, but the goal is that all FIPS will eventually meet international standards for due diligence. So the policy has three components. The first one outlines basic requirements that all FIPS reporting on the site will have to meet. And this includes signing our code of conduct, providing information on the vessels or fishers in the FIP, demonstrating that fishers are made aware of their rights, and that there's a mechanism available for reporting abuses. The fifth requirement is that FIPS must complete a self-evaluation that will show whether or not they meet certain risk factors for forced labor and human trafficking. And I'll share more about what those risk factors are in a moment. Then there is the second component, which outlines additional requirements that FIPS who meet one or more of the risk criteria will have to complete. So this includes conducting a risk assessment, which will show the true level of risk in the FIP. Once that's complete, if there are areas of high risk, then we ask the FIP to complete a work plan to address those areas of high risk, and then to report on implementation of that work plan every 6 months, just as FIPS do on the environmental side. If the risk assessment shows only low or moderate risk, then the FIP will not be required to complete and report on a work plan. And so these together, again, are the requirements of the second component, that is for FIPS that meet one or more of those risk criteria. So like I said, there's three components. The last one is to recognize that some FIPS will choose to exceed these minimum requirements as we have them laid out. For those FIPS, we have some basic guidelines, such as you have to use our template, you have to create a work plan to address high risk areas, and you have to report on implementation of that work plan. So again, this is the third component. It's for FIPS that are exceeding the minimum requirements outlined in component 1 and component 2. I mentioned that all FIPS have to complete a self-evaluation of certain risk factors. I'm going to go into those risk criteria now. So as you can see here, there are 5 of them. The first few focus on situational factors that occur most often in industrial fisheries. So that means FIPS that have transshipment, a significant foreign migrant workforce, or long trips at sea. We also have a criteria that will catch any FIPS that have had a known instance of forced labor, child labor, or human trafficking within the past 4 years. And then a final criteria to account for FIPS that just don't have enough data in order to complete this basic self-evaluation. And so again, these are the 5 criteria that make up the self-evaluation that all FIPS will need to complete. And it's meeting one or more of these criteria that determines whether or not the FIP has to complete a risk assessment that will show the true level of risk in the FIP. So how do we decide on these risk criteria? We decided to focus on these particular criteria, which occur most often in industrial fisheries for a couple of reasons. The first is that thanks to increased attention over the last several years, human rights issues in industrial fisheries are well documented. That means that we were able to define specific objective indicators that are evidence-backed and to be linked to the risk of an increased risk of human trafficking and forced labor. There's really not the same amount of research to provide these kind of indicators for small scale fisheries, not yet at least. The second reason is that industrial fisheries tend to have greater technical and financial capacity. And for this reason, we think that they're well placed to serve as leaders amongst FIPS to demonstrate the utility of completing a risk assessment in a work plan. Of course, this doesn't mean that we think that there are no issues in small scale fisheries. We know that there are. We know that child labor, debt bondage are some of the issues that occur in small scale fisheries. And that's why all of the other requirements in our policy are designed for fisheries of all scales. But that being said, we're committed to improving these criteria over time. So we're committed to looking at ways that we can better account for issues like child labor and debt bondage in the risk criteria themselves. And in a moment, when I pass it back to Kristen, she'll talk more about our plans to improve and strengthen the policy over time, including these risk criteria. So one hallmark of the FisheryProgress approach is to measure performance along a single yardstick. On the environmental side, we use the MSC standard. And on the social side, we will be using the Social Responsibility Assessment Tool, or SRA for short. We selected this tool for a few reasons. One is that it's comprehensive and it's based on existing social standards and tools. So when it was developed, it drew on 18 of those social responsibility standards and tools in order to provide a comprehensive set of indicators that each has its own criteria for high, medium, and low risk. And when I say comprehensive, I mean that it covers the full range of issues included in the Monterey Framework, which is a shared definition of social responsibility drafted by 33 NGOs and businesses, and includes the full range of issues. So that means human and labor rights, access to resources, equality and equity, livelihoods, and food security. And so this way, FIPS that are working on that whole range of issues will have a framework in which they can report on those. So it's again designed to be comprehensive as well as flexible. It's also flexible in that it accommodates FIPS that are working with a social standard and FIPS that aren't. And so that means for FIPS that aren't working with an existing standard or certification, it gives them a way to assess the social risk in their FIP. It also helps to identify actions to address areas of high risk. And then it's a way to measure improvement over time. For those FIPs that are working with an existing standard or certification, a benchmarking is currently being completed that will allow those FIPs to easily use their audit reports in order to complete the risk assessment. And so that way, it's easy and efficient to demonstrate the work that you've already done by plugging it into the SRA. So, of course, FisheryProgress is a website, and that means that alongside the policy, we have introduced two major changes to the site. The first major change is what you see here, and that is we've added a new section to the FIP at a glance box on the FIP's overview tab. So this new section that you see here covers the social performance of the FIP. It summarizes what they're required to do and what they've already submitted. That includes showing how many indicators of the SRA have been assessed, just like we do on the environmental side against the MSC standard. And then there's also a place that will demonstrate what FIPs are actively doing, what areas that they're working on in their work plan. The second major change we've made is to add a new tab dedicated entirely to social performance. So on this tab, you will find all of the documentation and information that FIPs submit to meet the policy's requirements. And in fact, we already have 24 FIPs on the site that are currently working towards implementing the policy and have information published on their profiles. There is a selection of those FIPs highlighted on the homepage, and I would encourage you to take a look, to click on those FIP profiles and kind of get a feel for what it looks like for FIPs to be reporting on their social performance. So now I'm going to hand it back to Kristen, who's going to talk about our plans going forward.
Super. Thank you so much, Amber. I want to dig in a little bit to how we're going to get this policy up and running and FisheryProgress's commitment to implementing it successfully. So first of all, I want to share with you FisheryProgress's goal truly is to help FIPs succeed at improving both their environmental and social performance within their fisheries. But we know that this is new. This is for a lot of FIPs that having the funding is going to be, could be a challenge, having the capacity is going to be a challenge. So we want to make sure that what we're doing is providing as much support as we possibly can to help FIPs meet our requirements and focus on improving their social performance. So the first thing we're going to do is provide hands-on support for FIPs. So we'll be providing intensive support and coaching, particularly for this first tranche of FIPs. We are encouraging FIPs to get started on this work early. Amber mentioned the 24 FIPs that are already on the site that have done some element of reporting. They haven't done everything yet. We wanted to encourage early folks to get on so that there's data to point to on the website, but we want to keep doing that. The first round of deadlines isn't going to hit for a little while, but we want FIPs to jump on this and really help provide us feedback on what the policy looks like on the ground, but also for us to be able to work with them one-on-one. So we'll be doing that. We'll be providing this intensive support and coaching, but this will be continuous. We'll be providing trainings and resources to all FIPs, whether they fit into that the higher risk context criteria or not. We'll be helping provide FIPs capacity to do this work over time. We'll also be advocating to buyers of all levels of supply chain to start investing in social responsibility. And I know many of you on this call likely already do. But for FIPs, knowing that, financial support is going to be absolutely essential in helping them meet these policy requirements. And whilst fundamentally we believe that these costs need to be borne from the supply chain itself, we also understand that it's not easy to sort of mobilize those funds right away. So FisheryProgress is working towards creating a fund. We're working with our donors and others to try to pull together a fund to help support FIPs get started on this policy, on implementing the policy early. So again, this would hopefully, if this all comes through, it would help FIPs do that first risk assessment that Amber pointed to. And then after that, they would have to integrate this work, the cost of this into the FIP itself moving forward. So more information on that fund coming soon, but just an indication that that's where we're heading. So finally, and this is really important to us, we're committed to strengthening this policy over time. So like I said, we have the group of early adopter FIPs that are starting this early. We'll be learning alongside them about how this policy actually works in practice. And our plan is to make refinements to the policy and the review guidelines that we've created after this first year of implementation. We just want to make sure we're getting this right. So we plan to make some fine tunes after this first year, once we've learned sort of what it looks like from these first early adopters. But alongside that, we'll be putting together a robust monitoring and evaluation plan. We want to understand, like, what impact is this policy actually having on the ground? So we haven't started that yet, but we will get it kicked off in the next month to really start, putting some data collection processes in place. And our intention is then to do a formal revision of the policy in 3 years' time. And what we want to do at that point is really better address the issues that Amber pointed out that the policy isn't fully covering right now, like child labor, debt bondage, and other human rights and labor challenges. We know that this policy hasn't gotten all the way there, but that's the goal, is in 3 years' time that we do get all the way there. And potentially at that 3-year mark, look at, could we move towards a goal of all FIPs on FisheryProgress completing this risk assessment and a social work plan? Can we remove that risk criteria that Amber talked through and really look at how do we make due diligence mandatory across all FIPs on FisheryProgress? So these are some of the ideas that we have to kind of continue a growth mindset with the implementation of this policy. But of course, if you have ideas or other thoughts, we'd love to hear those. And so finally, we've had a lot of questions about what can buyers do? What can buyers in this space do to kind of help energize this space, help push FIPS towards reporting? And so the first thing to share is that we've heard some feedback from FIPS that their buyers aren't asking them to address social responsibility. And granted, this is to a large extent, this comes from businesses based in North America. We've certainly had a lot of proactive businesses in Europe saying, pushing FIPS towards addressing social responsibility. But our first ask really is to just share the social responsibility commitments that your company has made. The second ask that we have is that you encourage the FIPS that you buy from to continue reporting on fishery progress and working towards meeting these policy requirements. They need to hear it from you. They can certainly hear it from us, but our voice is not as powerful as the supply chain that they work within. So hearing encouragement from buyers and others to continue to be transparent and report on fishery progress is really important for us. And of course, if FIPS have issues or concerns, they can come directly to us. We have a very open door policy. We're happy to answer questions and provide hands-on support, like I mentioned earlier in that earlier slide. But fundamentally, again, if FIPS understand that their buyers care about social responsibility and want them to continue reporting on fishery progress, that will create the incentive for them to do the work of meeting these requirements and tackling social responsibility in their fisheries. So that's our ask to you. But let me stop there and see if you have questions to clarify any of the things that Amber and I walked through, or feedback, thoughts on how this is going to mesh with your ongoing work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Amber. So yeah, I've already had a couple of questions messaged. So before I get on to them though, if anyone has any live questions, please either just shout them out or raise your hand, whatever works for you. While you're thinking about that, I'll pick one of my questions that I've got. Okay, how do I know if the FIP I'm buying from is high risk?
So the only way to really know the level of risk in the FIP is to do that due diligence, to do the on-the-ground risk assessment. And so we're really trying to steer people away from thinking that meeting a risk criteria means that the FIP is high risk, because it doesn't. It means that the FIP is operating in a certain context that would increase the risk, but it doesn't show whether or not they've implemented certain policies, procedures, et cetera, that would mitigate those risks. And so really, again, the only way to know that is to look at that due diligence, to look at the risk assessment.
Amber, the question might be about how do you see it? How do you see whether the FIP has met that risk criteria threshold on fishery progress? That might be the question.
So yeah, all the information that FIP submit will be on their social performance tab. And that's a way for you to go in there, use that information to support your own efforts to understand the FIPs that you're working with.
So you can see whether FIP has answered what they have answered to those criteria, the 5 questions that Amber pointed out. That's all going to be transparent on the website. So you can see if they've met that criteria or not, and then how they've responded.
Thank you. Question. If a FIP is due to enter MSC assessment in the next 6 months, will they have to address this new policy beforehand?
If they're still active on the site by November 1st, that's when the first set of requirements comes due, and that is signing the code of conduct and completing the self-evaluation. So if they're still active on the site then, or whenever their next report is due after November 4th, then they would still have to submit these.
And just to add to that, the requirements for MSC full assessment around social responsibility, there is a set of requirements. They're fairly minimal. So if the FIP does get started on reporting on their social responsibility risk on fishery progress and want to continue at that level of reporting, we will allow them to complete their FIP on fishery progress on the environmental side as they move into full assessment, but keep their social reporting live if they want to continue to be able to demonstrate the work they're doing around social responsibility risk and the work plan they're implementing.
Oh, that's helpful. I think you've actually answered another question there, which was the link between this policy and the current MSC status.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Sorry, just to add really quickly to that, we feel like MSC took a good stab at integrating social responsibility, and I think that they're looking at potentially what they could do to continue to grow that piece. But we recognize that what FisheryProgress is asking is a tick higher. So that's why we wanted to, and we did that very deliberately. That we feel like that we need to start raising the bar in terms of what fisheries are expected to do around social responsibility. And that we deliberately chose a higher bar than what MSC is set. But we're really hoping that MSC will start to follow suit and begin to raise the bar as well. But if that's not the case, then again, FIPs have the opportunity to continue to report on fishery progress, which we think is really important.
Thank you. Another question here. What is the level of alignment with social standards? It's quite an expansive question, I think.
Yes. So basically the SRA, which is what makes up, again, the framework upon which FIPS will report, is based on, like, it was developed by referring to 18 of these existing social responsibility standards and tools. So it includes in most cases more than like the minimum requirements set out in a lot of these social standards. So there's a whole third component in the social responsibility assessment tool that addresses more socioeconomic issues. And we were happy to have that because there are some FIPs that are working on those issues, and so it allows them to address that. That said, in terms of how does it align with a specific or a given standard or certification, Elevate, a global supply chain services provider, has mapped the SRA to 5 of those existing standards, and that includes Fair Trade USA, the Responsible Fishing Vessel Scheme, Seafood Task Force, Thai Union, and the ANOR APR standard. And so those are currently being finalized. Those benchmarks, those maps are currently being finalized with the standard holders, and then they will be published so that you can see standard by standard the alignment between the SRA and the standard itself.
Just to add quickly to that, our goal was to create an agnostic backbone so that we weren't creating some kind of a new standard or new certification. What we want to do is create an agnostic framework so that any FIP can come in and plug the data in that they might have from a standard or certification. So this shouldn't be something new. It shouldn't be requiring FIPs to go out unless they don't have anything at all, which is certainly a possibility. But what we're trying to do is make this backbone consistent. So again, just like on the environmental side, businesses can come in and compare FIP to FIP to FIP rather than having to say, okay, I have to understand fair trade and I have to understand the responsible fishing scheme. I can just look at one thing and understand it and make sure that and really compare FIPs across the whole spectrum.
Thank you. Final question from so far. How does this addition of the social policy impact the current definition of a comprehensive FIP?
That's a good question. Actually, a really interesting one, because the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions is actually undertaking a revision of the FIP guidelines. I pointed to a revision that happened in 2019 that included an indication of or urging FIPs to start addressing social responsibility. It's not a requirement. It's just a push. They're starting a new round of revisions this year, actually in the next couple of months, that will really take a hard look at what is social responsibility going to mean in terms of the broader FIP definition. And so there isn't agreement yet. That'll be a process to get there, to decide kind of how this will affect all of the definitions of basic and comprehensive FIP. For right now, I will share that this is a requirement on FisheryProgress. So it'll have consequences for all FIPs, regardless of whether they're comprehensive or basic. If a basic FIP fails to meet the requirements, they will have the same consequences as a comprehensive FIP. So it's across the board. I will also add that for the SFP progress ratings, the A through E ratings on the website, those ratings, because we don't have an influence on how those are created, they also do not take into account social responsibility right now. Hopefully in time that will change. I don't know, hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you. Yes, I got a thank you ping to me. Brilliant. Well, thank you. Well, that's all the questions I've had on the chat. Does our participants have anything that springs to mind that they'd like to ask? No. Okay. Well, if anything does spring to mind, I am sure Kristin and Amber wouldn't mind me forwarding your questions on, or you can go directly. There's Kristin and Amber's email address, but either way, I'm sure that will be no problem. So I will say thank you very much for joining the webinar, and a special thank you to Kristin and Amber for presenting. Like I say, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ping me or Kristin or Amber an email. The next webinar is going to be on the 9th of June, so the week of IOTC, and that's going to be on the Open Tuna Initiative, and that's going to be of great interest to GTA partners, I believe, as it demonstrates voluntary disclosure of data that can be used to identify vessels and support analysis as to whether the vessel is compliant with regulations, which of course is one of our work areas. So it could be interesting to see how that's been put into practice. So I'll wrap up with a final thank you to Kristin and Amber. Much appreciated to join us on this, and thank you for letting us record the webinar as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And absolutely, please feel free to get in touch with either of us if you have further questions or comments. We're open to it and would love to hear feedback. So, and thanks so much, Tom, for hosting.